October 3, 1965. The Karl Marx Theater. Havana. The atmosphere is dense, saturated with blind faith and the smell of tobacco. A fervent crowd has gathered, not to celebrate a victory, but to witness a political excommunication disguised as internationalist heroism. At the central podium, the maximum leader, Fidel Castro Ruz, holds in his hands a document that is not a government decree. It is the posthumous note of the political career of his most brilliant lieutenant, Ernesto Guevara de la Serna. The Comandante Che, the most marketable face of the revolution, the uncompromising ideologist who had built the Cuban economy, had vanished 6 months earlier. His physical absence had been an open secret. The public reading of his resignation letter that night was the official certification of his erasure. Fidel read the letter with a forced nostalgic intonation, mentioning Che's moral obligation to march to other trenches, to export the revolution to other latitudes. But the subtext was clear and cold. The intellectual and ethical engine of the regime had collided with the limits of Soviet bureaucracy and Castro's pragmatic survival instinct. The revolution, to stabilize itself, needed to strip itself of its utopian. It was the confirmation of the axiom that governs every power structure. When loyalty becomes criticism, even the closest friend must be exiled or silenced. Che had left voluntarily, but the public broadcast of his farewell was a masterpiece of narrative control, transforming the ideological dissident into a geopolitical martyr whose fate would no longer weigh on the island. His face shifted from vital asset to uncomfortable memory, ready to be frozen in time as a static revolutionary icon, incapable of criticizing the government he had helped found. This episode does not only tell the story of one man's fall. It tells the story of the birth of a manufactured myth. And to understand it, to prevent the great narratives from devouring the truth, you need to go back to the beginning. Because the story of Che Guevara is not the story on the poster. It is something far darker, far more complex, and far more instructive. Ernesto Guevara de la Serna was not simply a comrade in arms to Fidel Castro. He was the ideological catalyst of the Cuban Revolution. They met in Mexico in 1955, a city that was, at that moment, a breeding ground for exiles and dreamers. Guevara was a young Argentine doctor with a profound hunger for social justice, or, as some historians have put it, a compulsion toward conflict. In Fidel he found the military vehicle necessary to materialize his theories. Fidel offered the charisma and the political strategy to overthrow Batista. Che provided the doctrinal architecture, the hard, uncompromising Marxism that would transform a guerrilla revolt into a communist revolution. Their loyalty was forged in the mountains of the Sierra Maestra. Che was not Cuban. He had no blood ties to the island, which paradoxically made him more ruthless in the application of discipline. He rose quickly, distinguished not only by his courage in combat, he was asthmatic and physically fragile, but never avoided the front line, but by his intellectual cruelty toward the enemies of the movement. It was Che who commanded the crucial Battle of Santa Clara, a military triumph that shattered the morale of Batista's army and opened the road to Havana. When victory came, his reward was unusual. He was granted Cuban citizenship by birth. He was assigned responsibilities that demonstrated Fidel's absolute trust in him, but that also planted the seeds of his eventual destruction. As a key figure in the new government, Che did not take a cultural ministry or a health portfolio. He took 2 positions of economic and punitive power. He became head of the National Bank, and simultaneously, director of La Cabana, the military fortress that was transformed into the revolution's first tribunal and execution center. His role at La Cabana is one of the darkest and most systematic chapters in post-revolutionary Cuban history. His signature authorized hundreds of death sentences for those considered war criminals of the previous dictatorship and, more ominously, for those deemed counter-revolutionaries. In the revolutionary imagination, this was necessary justice. For historians, it was the consolidation of power through state terror. Che saw himself as an implacable executor of revolutionary ethics, convinced that ideological purification required extreme methods. While applying the iron fist at La Cabana, he simultaneously attempted, as head of the National Bank and later as Minister of Industry, to implement his utopian vision of socialism. He was obsessed with the idea of the new man, a citizen stripped of material incentives, motivated purely by moral duty and collective obligation. His economic plan was based on total centralization and forced diversification. He tried to eliminate the use of money and replace capitalist motivation with voluntary labor and moral bonuses. He was a radical economic idealist. But his management, marked by inexperience and contempt for the fundamental laws of supply and demand, began to fracture the Cuban economy. His blind faith in theory led him to ignore the material reality of the island. This duality defines the pre-rupture Che. The humanitarian doctor turned ideological executioner. The military strategist turned failed economist. He was indispensable to Fidel for his international prestige and ideological rigor. But his extreme radicalism was becoming an uncomfortable burden. The revolution had won. Now it needed to stabilize. And the engine of permanent chaos was, ironically, Che himself. The meteoric ascent of Che Guevara did not only place him at the apex of Cuban power. It placed him on an inevitable collision course with the geopolitical interests that guaranteed the island's survival. Initially, after the victory, the Castro-Guevara axis seemed unbreakable. Che positioned himself as the ideological purist, the guardian of the revolutionary flame, ensuring the new state did not decay into the bourgeois and bureaucratic vices they had fought against. By 1961, he controlled the threads of the economy and public morality. But his economic management, however ethically driven, met the hard wall of reality. The attempt at forced industrialization failed catastrophically. The island, which had historically depended on sugar monoculture, was not prepared for the qualitative leap he demanded. Factories installed with obsolete or inadequate technology. The rejection of market incentives. The imposition of voluntary labor that proved inefficient and inconsistent. Productivity collapsed. Che, in his obstinate purity, believed Soviet aid was welcome, but only as a tool toward self-sufficiency, not as structural dependency. That position generated the first major fracture with the direction Fidel was being forced to take. Then came October 1962. The missile crisis. Cuba had been used as a pawn in the nuclear chess match between Washington and Moscow. Khrushchev negotiated the withdrawal of the missiles without consulting Havana. Che took the slight as a personal affront and as proof of Soviet hypocrisy. From that moment, his criticism of the USSR, of what he called their revisionism, their state capitalism, became more open and more virulent. While Fidel, with his characteristic political skill, understood that Cuba could not survive without the Soviet protective umbrella and the economic subsidies that came with it. The divergence became public in 1964, during his tour of Africa. And then at the Afro-Asian Conference in Algiers in 1965, Che delivered incendiary speeches that put Fidel in an impossible position. He openly accused the developed socialist nations, meaning the USSR, of being tacit accomplices of imperialism through their unequal exchange with developing nations. For the government in Havana, which depended on 1 million tons of Soviet oil per year and billions in sugar subsidies, Che's words were pure dynamite. He was biting the hand that fed the revolution. Fidel faced an impossible choice. He needed the geopolitical stability that only Moscow could provide. But the international face of his revolution, Comandante Che, was a purist who threatened that stability. The Cuban state machinery, directed by Fidel, began a subtle but relentless process of distancing. Che's public appearances diminished. His articles in the state press became scarcer. The paranoia intrinsic to any revolutionary government began to see Che's intransigence not as idealism, but as a dangerous form of dissidence that threatened the vital alliance with the Kremlin. The idea of Che remaining at the center of economic and political decision-making had become untenable. Fidel's dilemma was not whether Che had to go. It was how to orchestrate his departure in a way that looked like a heroic continuation of the revolution rather than a political purge. The decision to marginalize him had already been made. All that remained was the heroic pretext, the one that would allow Fidel to claim Che's ideological legacy while ridding himself of his uncomfortable economic critic and international liability. Che's departure was not a spontaneous act of idealism. It was the result of systematic pressure that suffocated him in the labyrinth of power. A series of meetings and conversations were orchestrated in which Guevara was made to understand that his destiny was not in the administration of a state that had already committed itself to survival, but in the vanguard of the global revolution. The decision that Che had to go and fight in other lands was presented as an ideological imperative, a promotion to the pantheon of revolutionary immortals. In reality, it was a carefully camouflaged political exile. Che, with his uncompromising ethics, accepted the argument. If his presence in Cuba was an obstacle to the revolution's survival, he would leave. Sacrifice was an integral part of his ideology. The trap was not a physical arrest. It was a moral trap. He was allowed to leave, but under draconian conditions. To preserve the myth and Cuban security, Che had to renounce everything. He drafted the farewell letter that Fidel read months later at the Karl Marx Theater. In it, he renounced his posts, his rank of comandante, his Cuban citizenship. And most painfully, he formally severed every legal and emotional tie to Cuba, except the ideological one. This absolute renunciation was the key piece of the erasure. By surrendering his rights, Che politically self-invalidated and allowed Fidel to control the narrative of his disappearance, converting the critic into a wandering martyr whose only purpose was to carry the guerrilla flame to other latitudes. The state machinery had forced its own architect to sign his own erasure. The covert exile began with his journey to Africa, specifically to the Congo, in 1965. This adventure was the first attempt to export the revolution on a large scale. Che pursued it with the fervent belief that he could replicate the success of the Sierra Maestra. He was wrong. The Congolese guerrilla forces lacked the ideological discipline of the Cubans. The political and tribal environment was infinitely more complex than Batista's Cuba. The 9 months he spent there were a calvary of malaria, desertion, and frustration. The purity of his guerrilla model collided with cultural inertia and the utter lack of commitment from his supposed allies. During this period, Fidel knew his movements. He provided discreet logistical support, weapons, a few loyal Cuban soldiers. But he maintained a calculated political distance. The failure in the Congo, which ended in a humiliating retreat at the end of 1965, was the final psychological blow. Che returned to Cuba in secret. A defeated ghost, hidden in a protocol residence. He could not appear publicly. His erasure had already begun with the reading of his letter. The paradox was cruel. The man who had demanded maximum transparency and revolutionary honesty now lived as a shadow. A state secret. Consumed by the shame of the Congolese failure and his unbreakable need for ideological redemption, he proposed the next battlefield. Bolivia. Bolivia offered ideal geographic isolation and the rhetorical potential of being the heart of South America. The plan was discussed and approved by Fidel, not as a viable strategy, but as an honorable exit for a politically toxic comrade. Che accepted the conditions. The mission would be strictly his own. No visible official Cuban support. His identity maintained in total anonymity. He underwent a radical physical transformation, shaved his beard, shaved his head, wore glasses. The new man became an anonymous man. Dr. Ramon. Methodically erasing the icon the world knew. This denial of his own identity, demanded by Cuban state security, was the most subtle form of annulment. Che was not tortured with electricity. He was tortured with the unbearable weight of his own legend. He was forced to renounce his work and his name to embark on a mission that, if it succeeded, would redeem his purity, and if it failed, would guarantee Cuba's geopolitical tranquility. He departed for Bolivia in 1966, knowing that his return to Cuba was, at best, improbable. The second and definitive phase of Che's fall took place in the heart of South America. But his trial was not held in a formal court. It was held in the operational theater of the Nankawazu Valley, Bolivia. Once Che and his small group of guerrillas, mostly disguised loyal Cubans and a few Bolivian recruits, established themselves in the Bolivian jungle, they found themselves in almost total isolation. Che had departed with the conviction that he would find peasant support, a reenactment of the fervor he had witnessed in the Sierra Maestra. He was wrong again. The Bolivian peasantry was culturally and politically distinct from the Cuban. The presence of foreigners was not welcome. The guerrilla group became a foreign body in an ecosystem that rejected it. The failure was catastrophic and rapid. The first blow was the loss of 2 deserters who alerted the Bolivian army to the presence of an armed group led by a foreigner. The second and more devastating blow was the absence of the logistical support Che expected to materialize through Bolivian communist contacts that proved ineffective or, in some cases, treacherous. The Bolivian counterinsurgency forces, heavily trained and supported by CIA advisors, methodically encircled the group. Che's war diary, recovered after his death, is a chilling testimony of demoralization and despair. He recorded the diseases, the lack of food, the desertion of local recruits, and the relentless certainty that they were being cornered. Ideological purity cannot fight dysentery, hunger, and military superiority. The absence of official Cuban support, while a stated condition of his departure, is a crucial element of the story. Fidel maintained a distance that some historians interpret as geopolitical insurance. If Che succeeded, the glory would be Cuba's. If he failed, Cuba could deny all involvement. That denial of support was the death sentence. As the situation deteriorated in Bolivia, there was no significant attempt at rescue or reinforcement. Che was left to his fate so that the theory of guerrilla focus could prove itself or die by itself. The end came on October 8, 1967, in the Euro Ravine. Surrounded, exhausted, wounded in the leg, Che was captured at the small school of La Higuera. He was subjected to his final interrogation by Bolivian officers and CIA agents. There was no legal trial. The decision about his fate did not rest with a judge, it rested with the Bolivian High Command and the agency's need to prevent Che from becoming a living martyr, a focus of political instability who could be rescued or exchanged. The order was clear and concise. Immediate execution. On the morning of October 9th, a Bolivian sergeant entered the room. The execution was extrajudicial. An act of political murder, designed for the immediate elimination of the threat. Che, seated and defeated, died not in the heat of battle, but from the bullet of a state assassin in a rural barracks. It is reported that when he saw his executioner enter, he remained calm. That he said, "I know you've come to kill me. Shoot, coward. You are only going to kill a man." Whether those words are historically accurate or part of subsequent mythification is impossible to verify. What is certain is that Sergeant Mario Terán fired 9 shots. The death was instantaneous. The ideologist, the critic, the new man, silenced forever in a village schoolroom in the Bolivian mountains. What followed the execution was the first phase of intentional historical erasure. The body was transported by helicopter to Valle Grande, the nearest city. In the washroom of a local hospital, it was displayed to the press and the public, a deliberate act designed to prove to the world that the myth had died. It had the opposite effect. The image of the dead Che, eyes open, beard intact, took on a Christological quality for many who saw it. The physical elimination had been transformed into an icon of martyrdom. To prevent the creation of a shrine, the Bolivian army proceeded to amputate Che's hands. The grotesque act served a double purpose, providing fingerprint evidence of identity to intelligence services, and ensuring that without hands, the body could not be traditionally identified if found, making veneration at a known grave impossible. The body, along with those of 2 Cuban guerrilla companions, was taken to a secret location and buried in a mass grave, covered with earth and a layer of asphalt to complicate its discovery. Ernesto Che Guevara, the ideological architect of one of the most iconic revolutions of the 20th century, had been converted into a nameless body. A victim of the damnatio memoriae imposed by his enemies, and tacitly collaborated in by his allies, for reasons of geopolitical convenience. The death was a fact. The disappearance was a strategy. After the confirmation of his death in Bolivia, the most complex and prolonged phase of the erasure was activated. The manipulation of the legacy. A task that required both enemies and supposed allies working in the same direction. For the Bolivian government and the CIA, the elimination of Che was an operational triumph. For Fidel Castro, it was a narrative opportunity that had to be managed with extreme delicacy. Che had to stop being the living critic of Soviet and Cuban socialism and become the eternal martyr, the immaculate example of revolutionary purity. Cuba's initial silence about Che's whereabouts, while he was in the Congo and Bolivia, was fundamental to this erasure. For 2 years, between 1965 and 1967, Che Guevara did not officially exist in Cuban public life. Only after his death, which Fidel waited a full week to confirm publicly, was the myth reactivated. But stripped of all complexity, Fidel delivered a solemn speech honoring Guevara's heroism, presenting him as the model of the borderless revolutionary. The official narrative conveniently omitted any mention of the profound ideological frictions and the economic criticisms Che had directed against Soviet dependency and Cuban bureaucratization. The new man was transformed into an abstraction, a symbol of sacrifice who could no longer contradict the political decisions of Havana. The erasure manifested in strict document control. Che's Bolivian war diary was an explosive document. Fidel retained it for months. When he finally published it, he did so selectively, ensuring the text honored the Cuban cause and did not expose details that would compromise Cuban strategy or reveal the desperation and isolation of the guerrilla force. The photographic manipulation, while it never reached the levels of Soviet retouching where fallen figures disappeared from group portraits, focused on freezing Che's image at its most iconic moment. The bearded comandante staring into the distance. A symbol of resistance. Images of Che the economist, or images that showed him uncomfortable with government decisions, vanished from public discourse. Che became a poster icon. A revolutionary ghost, safe for export. The climax of this manipulation came 3 decades later. For years, Che's grave was a mystery. In 1997, after international pressure and an intensive search, his remains and those of several of his companions were discovered in the mass grave in Valle Grande, Bolivia, identified through the amputated hands that allowed fingerprint confirmation. Cuba orchestrated a triumphant return and a massive reburial ceremony in Santa Clara, the site of his greatest military victory. This event was the culmination of the erasure recreation. Che, the uncomfortable critic, returned as the immaculate patron saint of the revolution, which allowed the Castro regime, which had survived the fall of the Soviet Union and needed to reaffirm its legitimacy, to recycle his figure and his prestige. The return of the remains was not an act of mourning. It was an act of political calculation, cementing the myth of pure sacrifice, ensuring that the only version of Ernesto Guevara the world would remember was the one that served the Cuban state. The historical verdict on Ernesto Che Guevara is a symphony of contradictions. The simplification of his figure, achieved through his early death and the post-mortem narrative management, has transformed him into the universal symbol of youthful rebellion, unattainable utopia, and the struggle against imperialism. But a rigorous analysis of his period of power reveals a far darker and more complex figure. An uncompromising ideologist who was simultaneously a state builder, a relentless executor, and ultimately the victim of his own purity. Was he guilty or a victim? The answer lies in the analysis of his role in the state machinery. As commander of La Cabana, Che was guilty of implementing a system of summary justice that violated fundamental principles of due process. He sincerely believed he was executing revolutionary justice. But from a historical and human rights perspective, he actively participated in the consolidation of power through state terror. His contempt for legal formalities, in the name of revolutionary ethics, established a dangerous precedent for the regime he helped create. As Minister of Industry, he was the architect of failed economic policies. His insistence on the new man and his rejection of economic pragmatism caused significant damage to Cuba's productive infrastructure, forcing the country into even greater dependency on the Soviet Union. An irony he himself would have detested. And yet, in his fall, Che became, without doubt, a victim. A victim of his own intransigence, which made him politically unviable in the context of the Cold War. And a victim of the implacable survival logic of his best friend. Fidel Castro forced him to choose between the humiliation of staying and capitulating to Soviet pragmatism or heroic immolation on the battlefield. Che's choice of the second option was his death sentence. A sentence dictated by Havana's fear of Moscow's reprisal. The legacy of Che today is proof that a myth can be more powerful than the man. He is remembered for his face in the iconic Corda photograph, a symbol of romantic rebellion, while his record as chief of executions and his economic failures are relegated to footnotes. The true drama of the life of Ernesto Guevara de la Serna is not the heroism of his death. It is the irony of his life. The ideologist who built a relentless state machinery was ultimately ground up by that same machinery at the moment when his ideals became a risk to the stability of the system. His erasure was a double success. For his enemies who killed him and disappeared him, and for his allies who transformed him into a silent saint. The man who demanded truth above everything was converted, by the revolution he built, into the greatest lie that revolution ever told. Remembering is the only way to prevent history from keeping only the poster, and forgetting the lessons of how power devours its own children.